Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. My name's Greg Moffat and my guest today is author and international security analyst Dr Nafeez Mosaddeq Ahmed, and we'll be discussing his book, A User's Guide to the Crisis of Civilization and How to Save It, and the accompanying film simply titled The Crisis of Civilization. It often seems that different crises are competing to devastate civilization. The crisis of civilization argues that financial meltdown, environmental degradation, dwindling oil reserves, terrorism, and food shortages need to be considered as part of the same ailing system. Most accounts of our contemporary global crises focus on one area or another to the exclusion of the rest. The crisis of civilization suggests that the unwillingness of experts to look outside their own fields explains why there is so much disagreement and misunderstanding about the nature of the global threats that we face. The crisis of civilization attempts to investigate all of these problem areas not as isolated events, but as trends and processes that belong to a single global system. We are therefore not dealing with a clash of civilizations, as Samuel Huntington argued, nor have we witnessed the end of history that Francis Fukuyama prematurely declared. Rather, we are dealing with the end of the industrial age, a true and fundamental crisis of civilization itself. Hello and welcome Nafeez Ahmed, and thank you very much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Thanks Greg, it's a pleasure to be on.
Now Nafeez, we're here today to discuss your film The Crisis of Civilization, which is based on your book, A User's Guide to the Crisis of Civilization and How to Save It. So perhaps we could start out with an overview of this, which seems to me to be essentially that when we look at the laundry list of problems that the world is facing, we have a tendency to look at each one in isolation, and this comes from our human nature that we've developed. We're living in a sort of illusion of separateness, and that we're somehow not part of nature, which of course wasn't always the case at all. Arguably for most of our existence we were very much part of nature. And if we take a more holistic view of the situations we're facing and realise that everything's interdependent, then that really does change the game.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, when I started working on this project, I was actually still doing my PhD, and about genocide and the structural context of genocide. And what was happening, what inspired me to kind of look into these bigger issues like climate change and energy and the food crisis, etc., more in detail, was the more I started to look at the kind of surface symptoms of war and conflict, the more you find that there are actually these deeper structural and systemic causes which lead people to engage in conflict, and it doesn't just lead them in a kind of in a kind of very simplistic cause-effect way, which is a deterministic thing. But rather it's because of the ideologies that people carry and the way in which they interpret the structural and systemic challenges that they're facing that often leads them to resolve it through violence and conflict. So the more I started to look into that kind of stuff, as I started to get more interested in the environmental context of conflict or the energy context of conflict, I started to realize that even those bigger crises that we're looking at are framed in this very, very fragmented way within the conventional scientific discipline. And that's not to say that science in its current form hasn't brought with it a huge amount of knowledge. It hasn't made massive progress in our understanding of the way certain things work. There's no doubt about that. But the problem is that the way in which our science functions right now, because of the need for expertise and for understanding specific things, there is this kind of disciplinary kind of obsession with going deeper and deeper and deeper into understanding very small kind of subsets of what is going on and specializing more and more and more. And as we specialize more and more and more, we tend to kind of miss the way in which our specialisms are inherently interlinked within the actual real world to other specialisms and other disciplines. And as a consequence, we've completely missed. We don't have a science or scientific framework I mean, obviously there are people trying to develop scientific frameworks, and we don't really have ingrained within science at the moment a way of looking and linking up these things holistically and seeing how biology, the environment, physics, all of these things are actually fundamentally part of one spectrum of reality. Instead, we're always looking at one thing. As a consequence, we really are out of touch with the speed, scope, and pace of the crises that are currently underway in terms of climate change, energy, the food crisis, the economic crisis, and the way these are both escalating each other and escalating the propensity to all kinds of conflict.
Well, there's sort of a problem of distrust almost of interdisciplinary work, and people who, for example, if you get biologists who are maybe working on a problem and they find that they need to learn something about chemistry, maybe get into that area in order to advance their work. It's almost like the perception is, oh, you shouldn't be doing that. You need to stay within your field. And of course, a lot of the useful and more interesting cutting edge science is interdisciplinary just by necessity, but still there's this persistence that you're out of your depth, and never mind scientists crossing over into other fields. If you have lay people, however well educated, who then perhaps advance ideas or solutions on a scientific basis, that you're not accredited, you're not qualified, you haven't been peer reviewed, etc., etc. That in itself is a big problem.
Yeah, the thing is that I'm all for, and I understand why there are certain standards. Like I understand the logic of peer review, which is that scientific knowledge should be tested, and there should be, you should have peers who have some kind of experience in the field, looking at it and kind of all of them kind of mutually assessing, and it seems like a really great idea. And in practice, however, I think there is a danger, and even there are people who've studied scientific paradigms and how they evolve. I mean, the whole Thomas Kuhn thing about paradigms and how they shift and all of that. It does raise interesting questions about how perfectly well evidenced and well tested scientific ideas sometimes cannot be taken seriously in the majority scientific community, precisely because of the groupthink dynamic that can tend to dominate in some circles. But at the same time, I think it's important to not then develop a completely. I mean, one thing that I've seen that has developed, for example, in the way people have responded to climate science, is a deep anti-science perspective, which is obviously a kind of a slightly irrational and regressive reaction. And while I think there's scope to be critical of scientific orthodoxy in some cases, and to be engaged in that, and be trying to move the debate forward, and to recognise that you do get sometimes aggressive groupthink dynamics, we should always challenge. At the same time, we don't want to fall into the trap of anti-science, which could open the door to just all kinds of ridiculous and kind of out there thinking, which is not grounded in some kind of a coherent evidentiary basis. At the same time, there are many fields which are not recognized by orthodox science, which really have massive amounts of proof for them. And you're looking at some of the new developments in physics, some of the implications for even things like telekinesis and things like that, which we know for a fact that there have been government programs which have experimented with this, and very senior physicists who have been involved in looking at that kind of stuff. So I think it's important to recognise that there are sometimes interesting reasons why establishment doesn't want to kind of give credence to certain trends of thinking which may challenge the orthodoxy.
Well, there's two things there. We mentioned out there thinking, and how that can be sometimes misleading and erroneous, and a complete distraction, leading us nowhere, not tested, not proved, not provable. But equally, the issue there is that sometimes it's out there thinking that holds the key to the solution. A lot of great scientific quantum leaps have been taken by people who were, to use the old cliche, thinking outside the box. The other side of that, then, of course, is that science has been manipulated to serve other agendas and to other ends. And the cases of that have led some people, as you say, to become anti-science. But we can't really afford to throw out the baby with the bathwater in this case. in the sea of information that we now have, particularly in the internet age, it's trying to discern what's verifiable, what rings true, what's testable, and just sifting through all that for what we can actually use, and just understand that we have to, in this day and age, put up with that background noise, a lot of which might be nonsense.
Absolutely. I mean, I totally agree with you. I think it's important to recognize that the core of what we call good science is about having a consistent respect for evidence, being self-critical and self-aware, trying to kind of separate out your own perceptions and your own kind of beliefs from the evidence, and being clear that trying to make sure that you're not influencing your investigations of these things, being critical of all kinds of different thinking from a rational perspective, using logic. I think it's all about what you said about being things being verifiable, being testable. I think those are the fundamental principles of science which we try to apply, and I think we can be critical of scientists when we think they are failing to apply those principles in a fair and balanced way. And that's absolutely the case. And it's true, like what you said about the way science progresses. And I think actually this is recognized within mainstream philosophy of science, that often science fundamentally progresses by the minority, by the irate minority who stumbles upon something which will challenge the prevailing paradigm. I mean, Einstein, for example, was not, when he first discovered his theories at the beginning, was not considered to be part of that mainstream orthodoxy. So many of the major scientists who've influenced contemporary science were not part of the kind of establishment orthodoxy of science. So it's important to have an open mind, I think, and to just try and be always be critical and aware.
Now, in the question of science being used to serve other agendas, scientific evidence being manipulated or misrepresented, that does happen, of course, and we've just discussed some of the negative effects of that. And perhaps where that's most evident is with the issue of climate change, stroke global warming, whatever you want to call it. Not so much the wider environmental problems of pollution, but in this specific area, which is a huge issue as going forward, the science and the truth of it, or otherwise, it has become a sort of real stumbling block.
Yeah, there's definitely a perception that the science around this has been muddied. I mean, and obviously in the film we weren't able to go into detail on the issue of how to navigate the spectrum of dissent around this issue. But one of the reasons I actually started this whole project was because when I was starting to go into all of these different things, I myself felt confused by the range of opinions seemingly amongst experts on all of these issues, on climate change. You had some people saying it was real, some people saying it wasn't real, some people saying it's completely man-made, some people saying that it's not even happening. All of them kind of claiming scientific credentials. Even on energy, we still have this big debate about peak oil. Is it happening? Is it not happening? On the economic crisis, what's the cause of it? So in all of these things, I felt that there really was a sense of confusion about what was going on. So I set out to try and that's why I called it a user's guide. I set out to really try to sift through and make sense of all of this stuff. When I went through the climate change stuff, I started off quite confused about that. But as I went deeper into it, it became clearer and clearer to me that, generally speaking, there is definitely an overwhelming consensus amongst climate scientists on the reality of climate change. And as I went into it, I looked at the skeptic arguments, and there's a massive minefield. I tried to tackle most of the main ones in my book, and actually, in the first chapter of my book, I systematically go through a lot of the skeptic arguments to do with, for example, is global warming actually happening? If so, what is causing it? Is it caused by cyclic variations in the Earth's atmosphere? Is it caused by the sun? various different arguments that are put forward. And I came to the conclusion that climate change is real. And actually, what I found interesting was that rather than, if anything, rather than the situation being that the kind of the climate change, the climate scientist consensus is too kind of alarmist, I actually came to the conclusion that the consensus is actually quite conservative. And I ended up speaking to a number of scientists who feel that actually the science there's been an effort by government to actually dampen the implications of the evidence. And we've seen this, and I talk about this in my book, the way that the IPCC has actually been interfered with by government policymakers to try and make its findings more palatable and to fit with a very, very simple kind of business as usual approach to say, we'll just carry on what we're doing, we'll have like carbon trading. And the effect of that, interestingly, has been that governments you've had different political spectrum using climate science in different ways. So you've had people on the more left side of the spectrum in the political scene talking about carbon trading and trying to maximize the financialization of this whole sector and make massive profits out of it. And on the more right-wing side, you've had elements of the political spectrum trying to hijack climate science to basically justify much more state control and saying, we should basically try and use all of this to kind of increase the power of the state, and the public has to basically pay up and deal with this, rather than the fundamental sources of CO2 emissions are not actually just your general public. It's the big companies, it's your airlines, it's most of the big major fossil fuel companies that have lobbying influence on government. So you're talking about big major corporates. They're the ones that need to really be sorting out what they're doing, as opposed to purely the public has to take all the responsibility. So, and then obviously you've got other ends of the spectrum who completely deny the science as well, and say that no, actually we have another view of the science, and they're saying, and interestingly, most of those guys are also taking money from the fossil fuel industry. So it's quite an interesting web of interests that are involved in this debate.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the corporate element of all this, which, of course, has turned has given people, skeptics, reason to be skeptical, even more so, and those who are like on the fence, perhaps reasons to join the skeptics, is that what they see with carbon trading and what have you is just another business opportunity, and they also feel, and this is perhaps linked to what you're saying about the implications of climate change that released to the public are perhaps being dampened down somewhat by scientists and government, that people feel that they're being, someone's crying wolf here, that we've been warned that X, Y, and Z is going to happen. Another decade goes by, it doesn't happen, but of course environmental change can happen very, very suddenly, a bit like stepping off a cliff. But it's almost like people are constantly being given reasons to buy into the business as usual model.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is a fundamental concern of the way in which special interests have been exploiting and manipulating science in order to basically justify their own agendas. And this is something that we flagged up in the film, and I've also mentioned in the book, is the way in which the problem of climate change has been. I think the problem of climate change is very real. However, the way in which governments have responded has been designed to continue business as usual, and actually to actually empower and increase profiteering by a tiny minority of banks and corporations. And carbon trading is one of those things where, if you actually look into it, it has very little effect on actually ameliorating carbon emissions. And there was a study by Deutsche Bank which actually looked into the effect of carbon trading and whether it would deal with CO2 emissions. And their resounding answer was this, it's actually having a negligible effect and possibly making it worse, because what's happening is you've got this situation where a company which is involved in exploiting the fossil fuels and ripping apart the environment can basically buy loads of carbon credits and say, hey, we've got all of these. Once they've bought those carbon credits, they can put that on their books as this is the amount of emissions that we've reduced, and then they can say we're very, very green. And actually, what they're doing is continuing business as usual, and everybody thinks they're green. So there is this process of greenwashing that people talk about.